We have to act with urgency.
State lawmakers say we're falling behind in the affordable housing crisis. And developers say they're facing too many restrictions on what and where they can build.
Really right now we've only got certain zones that allow you to do multifamily.
But does the so-called missing middle plan to require nearly every city to allow fourplexes to be built in all residential zones have a strong enough foundation?
The parking minimums is going to be a challenge.
It's just that there are a lot of unintended consequences.
We hear from two mayors from either side of the state to get the story.
We had to do something bold.
Is the infrastructure in place?
Does the missing middle bill measure up or miss the mark? We're nailing down some answers next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. We all know the rising cost of housing is a crisis in our state. But is a plan requiring cities to get rid of single-family housing zones part of the answer? House Bill 1110, the so-called missing middle bill, would mandate that cities with at least 6,000 residents need to allow fourplex housing in all residential areas or sixplexes in areas close to major transit stops. Opponents say this bill could hurt cities by forcing them to add costly infrastructure and potentially increasing displacement from older affordable housing units. But supporters say the state has to act now with a housing shortage that's getting worse every year.
The fundamental underlying challenge is that we do not have enough housing in our state for our people.
It doesn't take a proclamation from the governor to know. Housing prices in Washington have quite literally gone through the roof.
And it's simple supply and demand. There's just not enough houses. We've had a huge influx of people coming in, all the tech workers, and we just can't build houses fast enough.
Michael Pollard is vice president of Entitlement for Shelter Homes, a local home builder creating new units like these townhomes in Kirkland. There's just one problem.
We always run into the challenge of nobody wants development in their backyard after their development is done.
Resistance toward adding housing density is a statewide issue exemplified in Seattle, where a majority of the residential areas are zoned for single-family homes, not duplexes or fourplexes that Pollard says could provide a major boost to our housing supply.
If you can get 2, 3, 4 done on a given lot, then that allows more lots to be developed, and it opens up a sea of new land for us to develop on.
Representative Jessica Bateman says this zoning issue has left most local prospective home buyers zoned out.
First-time home ownership is only affordable in 3 counties in Washington state. They're all in eastern Washington.
Bateman, the Democrat from the 22nd District in Olympia, is prime sponsor of House Bill 1110, the missing middle bill focused on middle-income earners.
Washington is experiencing a housing shortage, which is culminating in a housing crisis.
1110 would require cities with a population over 6,000 to allow for development of at least 4 units per lot on all areas now zoned for residential use, 6 if 2 of the units are affordable.
Today, we are a united front.
Both sides realize that we can no longer accept the failures.
The measure has bipartisan support this year after Bateman's unsuccessful attempt to pass it in 2022. And she says the data from places like Portland, which eliminated single-family zoning last year, shows the policy can work.
It's a diffuse absorption of population growth. You're not seeing entire, blocks being bulldozed down and sixplexes going up in all of them.
Bateman says our state is currently 140,000 units behind in terms of housing supply. And we'll need 1 million more homes in the next 20 years to handle population growth. So the time to act is now.
So if we want a future where young people can buy homes, start families, build equity, people have affordable rent, we do have to treat this with some urgency.
I do believe that our legislators are doing this with the best of intentions. There are just some unintended consequences that we want to make sure don't happen.
Auburn Mayor Nancy Backus works with the Association of Washington Cities, which rejects what it calls HB 1110's one-size-fits-all approach.
One of the challenges that we have with the current structure of the bill is the uniform application of this in all cities over 6,000 on all parcels.
Backus says new housing means new needs for infrastructure, like electric service and sewers. Big money projects, for smaller cities especially.
The infrastructure is not there to support the additional density in those neighborhoods. Well, that's a cost to the city that obviously is going to be passed on to our ratepayers.
And she says the bill's requirement to add density specifically in areas within a half mile of major transit stops could mean developers will buy up and tear down older existing affordable units, leaving many of her residents without a home.
Where do they go? We're required to make sure that there's no displacement, but this law itself is going to create displacement.
Backus says her city is not anti-density. She says more than 2,000 units of affordable housing have been built here in the last 5 years.
Auburn is very affordable. I'm very proud of that.
And Auburn and other cities want to make sure a new state zoning requirement doesn't complicate local housing efforts already underway.
We just want the ability to work through processes that we've already begun and not have to scrap that for a statewide process that may not fit with all the work that's already been done and all of the money that's already been spent for that plan.
Despite the critiques, many signs point to the passage of HB 1110 this year, as our state looks at solving a housing crisis with a long road ahead.
I think it really does need to come from the state level.
To discuss this issue further, we have two mayors with us from either side of the state. We have Keith Scully, he's the mayor of Shoreline, in our studio. Mayor Scully, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have with us Mayor Nadine Woodward from the city of Spokane. Mayor Woodward, good to have you as well.
Great to be here, Brian.
I think you have some different experiences when it comes to affordable housing, and I'm very appreciative of having your input today. And Mayor Woodward, maybe I can start with you here. So when the state was not able to pass a missing middle housing bill last year, Spokane basically enacted its own version of that legislation. Talk to us about building opportunity and choices for all, the BOCA ordinance. It's an interim one-year ordinance that you championed. The city put it into effect in August of last year. What is it? Why did you support it? What impact is it having?
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's really a win-win between the administration and the legislation community and all the stakeholders in the housing issue. And what we found out was we had 8 in 10 families that could not afford a home in Spokane County. Our median price of homes have gone up to $400,000, nearly double what they were before the pandemic. We've seen a huge migration of people moving to the east side of Washington from Western Washington and California. Tight supply, high demand. I declared a housing emergency and we got to work very, very quickly. We had already been working on a Spokane Housing Action Plan that came from a commerce grant that we had brought the community together and listened to what the needs were. But we took that plan, brought it to my housing task force that helped inform that even more. But what it basically does to address the missing middle is it allows duplexes and townhomes on any residential lot, and also triplexes and fourplexes on busier transportation lines and corridors. So what it really has done is allowed us to use vacant lots in the city, in neighborhoods, in a way that they could not be used before.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Mayor Scully, I want to talk about what's going on in Shoreline and your approach to this issue. There's a lot of growth that's happening in your city, as you well know, and the city has approved upzones in several areas around light rail stations and high-capacity bus lines. I want you to tell us about how your city has responded to growth, this whole missing middle question. What do you got?
So we took a slightly different approach than Spokane did. Instead of upzoning across the board, we picked a few areas around existing high-capacity transit and upzoned intensively there. So right around the light rail stations and along Aurora, which is served by bus rapid transit, we allow what we call MUR 70, which is a 70-foot height limit, and it's mixed-use residential. So you can put businesses there or you can put housing there. And what folks are building is rental housing. We had hoped there would be some condominiums going in there so folks could afford to buy a place. That, for the most part, hasn't happened. But then surrounding those intense zones, we've got less intense zones, which are generally still within a half-mile walk shed of high-capacity transit. Mm-hmm. And those are zoned for either 35 or 45-foot height limits, and those are townhouses. And those have been going up like mushrooms.
Okay.
You can't move without tripping over a townhouse in Shoreline.
Okay.
The unfortunate thing is we had hoped townhouses would be where folks started buying their first homes. They've been retailing for between $800,000 and $1 million each. which sort of is not the end goal we were hoping for, although the more supply you add, hopefully we'll eventually see those prices start to come down.
Thank you. And I want to kind of expand on this idea and talk about what the state's discussing here with House Bill 1110, this missing middle bill. It's one of more than a dozen bills related to housing that's happening in Olympia. So HB 1110 would require cities with populations of 6,000 or more to allow fourplex housing in all residential areas at sixplexes in areas near major transit stops. Mayor Scully, is that a good idea?
So I'm opposed to it, but
Okay.
I'm really curious to hear about Spokane's experience with it.
Yeah.
Because our concern is simply because it's in a city doesn't mean it's near transit, right? I mean, Shoreline is very dense to start with. We are pretty much built out, but there are still neighborhoods where if you add 6 more cars to a street, that's 6 more cars parked on the street, and those folks are not going to be able to walk to transit because it's not walkable.
Okay.
It's walkable in some parts of the city, it's not walkable in others. And without that access to high capacity, my concern is not only are we not decreasing our dependence on automobiles, but we're kind of trashing our cities.
Okay.
We're adding density in places it doesn't need to be.
Okay.
And while it's better to be in a city than not in a city, simply because it's in a city doesn't mean it's necessarily in the right spot.
Fair enough. Mayor Woodward, I just wanted your thoughts about this and maybe your take on this idea of maybe bringing Boca to a statewide level. Do you think that would be a good thing?
Well, I do, because it's definitely working for us. But as far as the state, I don't know if the state legislation right now is going to change much or impact the city of Spokane much because of what we've already done. I mean, it would just increase fourplexes to sixplexes
Right.
in those busy corridors. But what we're seeing in our pre-development permitting is a lot of interest and a lot of action based on Boca. Now, whether or not all those units go through, that's another thing, but
Yeah.
lots of interest. We're not seeing any huge pushback. In fact, we're seeing more support than we ever thought we would in neighborhoods, because the building that we're suggesting has to meet the already existing design and building standards.
Okay.
So you're not going to tear down an historic home and build something modern. And we have seen absolutely no tear downs
Okay.
Through this. So it's been very favorable.
Okay. Good to know. Keith.
Well, I sorry to take your job, but
Please,
I'm
go for
curious,
it.
Mayor Woodward, in the less dense areas of the city, how much have you seen? How many folks are putting a cottage in their backyard?
Well, actually, the ADUs have been very, very popular, and that was
Okay.
another reform measure that we've done. We've had dozens of those permitted already, starting in 2022 and into 23. So actually, a lot of interest in that.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I guided this back, Mayor Scully, in talking about some of the infrastructure issues that can sometimes come with this, because I know that's been a concern here. You add this extra density, it might add some extra needs for infrastructure. Some thoughts on that?
No, for sure. And that was a big constraint of what we did. And we had to work with, our electricity comes from Seattle City Light. We had to work with them to make sure we had power. We worked with our water district, which is independent of the city, to make sure we had water. And when we built it, or when we designed it, we went block by block, and we asked, 1, is this going to be walkable to transit? 2, is the infrastructure in place?
Yeah.
Not just water and sewer, but also sidewalks. Is there enough parks? And we made sure that as we designed it, that when it was fully built out, we'd be able to support it.
Okay.
And my worry, and again, I'm fascinated to hear about Spokane.
Yeah.
My worry is if you start just dropping this here and there, you're going to find that infrastructure does get stretched, because our infrastructure was designed for single family back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when Shoreline was first built out.
I see. Mayor Woodward, maybe you can break this down for us. Has this infrastructure piece been an issue in Spokane? I know it's very early yet with the Boca process because it just went into effect in August of last year, but let us know about infrastructure and how that plays a role here.
Yeah, we have not had any issues with infrastructure concerns, and certainly we looked at that before we passed Boca. We are utilities, so we provide water. We do use Avista for electricity, but our situation is different. We're an old city. I mean, the city of Spokane has been around since the mining and timber days, and when we had housing crisis 100 years ago, we were doing multifamily housing throughout the neighborhood. So our infrastructure may be a bit aging. We're keeping up. Our capital improvement projects have really been good about keeping up with that. But we have seen no problems with infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And I should point out the state is looking at this issue while discussing this bill in Olympia. Could offer some extensions to some cities if this does pass, possibly other assistance if there's a demonstrated need for infrastructure here. But Mayor Woodward, maybe I can stick with you for another question here. Other jurisdictions around the country have already passed measures that are similar to HB 1110, the state of Oregon, the state of California, and the data I've seen from those cities seems to show what you're talking about. It's a gradual infill. Is it kind of a rush here with Boca? Are these things popping up overnight, or what's been that situation in Spokane with the passage of Boca? How quickly is this infill moving in?
It's very, very gradual. As I mentioned, even our pre-development activity is about 200 plus units, and those haven't even been fully approved yet. So it's very, very slow. We anticipate, one thing that we know when we change zoning, things don't just change overnight.
Right.
Certainly they haven't experienced that in Spokane at all, but we just knew we were in such crisis mode for housing that we had to do something big. We had to do something bold. It has gotten broad support and favorable comments from some of the neighborhoods. I'll just say some of the historic neighborhoods were a little bit concerned, especially those who already have preservation protections. But they're not seeing the teardowns that they thought that they would. What they're seeing is vacant city lots that now can be utilized and developed like they couldn't before because of some of the issues or concerns, structural issues that didn't pan out for single family. Now it does for a townhouse.
Okay. I guess, Mayor Scully, in looking at this, it looks like other jurisdictions have had a relatively mild experience with this whole missing middle piece. Do you think it would be different in Shoreline for some reason?
I do, and I mean I have fantasies about vacant city lots.
Okay,
we just don't have. We of course have a few, but
sure.
But that's just not the way Shoreline looks. It's pretty much built out, and my concern is exactly that we're going to get 200 units, which doesn't really do much for affordable housing. We have thousands in the pipeline in Shoreline in the high density areas. We're going to get 200 units, and they're going to be plopped down in places where they don't really fit.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get a cul-de-sac, which has been built out since the 60s, which is nowhere near transit. And all of a sudden, you've got, instead of 8 houses, you've got 12. And the neighborhood is just not set up for that.
Yeah.
Cities absolutely have to take more density. We have to do it. We have to upzone. And cities, they're trying to preserve their rural feel, as some of them claim. That's missing the boat. But in my belief, we need to do it carefully, and we need to do it only in certain parts of the city that can accommodate the kind of growth we want to see.
Can I go down one path with you, Mayor Scully, about parking specifically? I know that's a piece of the puzzle here, too. Your concerns about that, because I know the state's talking about that issue, too.
So we require 0.75 parking spaces per unit for one-bedroom units, which means that there is going to be more units than there are spaces for cars. But what we've found, and what I think is pretty consistent across the nation, is that if you're next to high-capacity transit, some folks will finally decide they don't need a car, or they don't need a second car, or they don't need a third car, or their kid doesn't need a car.
Okay.
And that problem will solve itself for the high density.
Okay.
What actually worries me more on parking is we've got a giant area around Shoreline that is going to be driving to our light rail stations. So I'm worried our neighborhoods are going to get inundated with folks from out of town, from the single-family neighborhoods, who want to drive to light rail and then park.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about very different cities here, but I really like this cross comparison. Mayor Woodward, can you talk to us about parking, and was that part of the discussion, part of what was going on with Boca here in talking about it?
That's always a consideration, Brian. What we're seeing, and we're much different than Shoreline, as you mentioned, is that we have so many people who can't afford, who work in the city of Spokane or Spokane County, but can't afford to buy housing, are living now across the border 30 miles away in North Idaho. And we're seeing more car and carbon on our highway, on Interstate 90. And so if we can get those who work in Spokane to be able to live in Spokane, we can address that environmental impact.
Got it.
But parking is certainly a concern. I understand, and I agree with Mayor Scully on that.
Yeah, I know that the state is also working on that issue to try to figure out some different pieces. This is very much legislation that is in process, so I appreciate this back and forth. Mayor Woodward, let me go back to you here, because I think the flip side of this question here is when we talk about hundreds of units being built, I know you need thousands, and so I'm trying to figure out a way you could incentivize builders to build more units, especially more affordable ones, because I think this is a part of the puzzle too. Building homes for people doesn't always pencil out for developers when you're building these units for people who maybe make less than median income and things of that nature. How has Spokane approached this idea of trying to offer incentives potentially for builders?
Yes, we have, and we've used some of our ARPA funds for this, a Projects of Citywide Significance Fund that we can help these developers who are building special projects get compensation for some of the infrastructure or some of the permitting fees that they need and we also have a concierge service within our own permitting and development services department that kind of walks alongside some of these developers, especially with more complex projects, to make sure that they're meeting all the deadlines, getting everything that they need in order before a filing is made. So those are some of the things that we're doing right now. We also have new funding streams for affordable and low income housing, because I think when we talk about housing, we have to look at the entire picture.
Right.
I'll just be honest, we need housing at every single level. But now our city council has increased sales tax so that we've got some buckets of money that are accumulating, coming into our city that we can now use to address low income and low income supportive permanent housing as well.
Thank you very much for that. Mayor Scully, some thoughts from you. What incentives do you think would help developers build more? What are you hearing from builders?
So we're doing a lot of that, and it's effective for the rentals. It's not effective for the purchased homes. So in our high-rise zones, the mid and high-rise zones, it's mandated. It's not an incentive. You have to do it. You want to build a high-rise in Shoreline, it has to be 20%. 20% of it has to be affordable to 80% area median income or below. And that has not been an impediment. You see construction cranes all over Shoreline. It's getting built. Mm-hmm. In those zones and in every zone, we offer a huge number of incentives. There's a state program, which is a property tax exemption program. That's our most significant one. And my understanding is, I think any city is eligible for that. Mm-hmm. If it's the PTE, property tax exemption funding stream. Folks take advantage of that. And for rentals, we're doing okay. I mean, Shoreline is fairly affordable if you want to rent there. You were talking about family members who might move here. Have a look at Shoreline.
Okay.
Right? I mean, it's a little cheaper than Capitol Hill. In fact, it's a lot cheaper than Capitol Hill.
Right. And the nightlife, come on. Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Right. But the sale prices, I mean, I mentioned earlier, these townhomes that we thought would be where folks bought their first home, $800,000 to $1 million. You really can't find a single family house of any variety in Shoreline for less than $600,000. It's just not there. And I don't have a solution for that. I'm not sure we really can incentivize for sale properties the same way we can rental properties, just because of the way the financing and funding streams work.
Got it. Thank you for that. Mayor Woodward, I wanted to ask you another question with regard to naturally affordable housing. And I know you've heard this phrase too. We're talking about older units, for example, that might have lower rents. If a lot of builders do end up jumping in to build new housing, is there any concern that these older units might get knocked down and new units have come in? I know that's not happening yet with Boca, but that whole concept of naturally affordable housing and trying to preserve it, I think that's part of this discussion too.
Yeah, that's something that we're discussing as well. As you mentioned, we haven't seen it. What we're very concerned about right now is anything at the legislature that would penalize landlords. And I know that there are a lot of landlord tenant protection bills right now. Our city council is considering one themselves. I think we have to be very careful. Tenants need to be supported. If we have some landlords that aren't providing safe housing, we need to address that. And we do have that in our city, maybe about 2%, but the majority, especially those mom and pop landlords, we cannot afford to lose housing with punitive regulations and restrictions on them. And cities that have passed strict landlord ordinances have seen thousands of units lost to families.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. I just wanted to follow up with you, Mayor Scully, this issue of displacement, naturally affordable housing, and this issue. I think this is a part of the discussion for a lot of cities around the state.
So in Shoreline, we're having displacement, but it's generally not centered around the light rail. It's around folks taking an affordable older home, tearing it down and building a non-affordable giant new home.
I see. Okay.
We have a ton of redevelopment going on in our single family neighborhoods. And it is all $1 million, $1.5 million, big, giant, as much of the lot as they can cover houses. It's done by developers. It's fine. I mean, it's just the way the city's going.
Right.
But in terms of displacement, affordable housing, we're getting way more affordable housing from the high rises than we're losing from losing the single families that they replace.
I see that the McMansion factor, that's right. A part of what's going on here. Mayor Scully, I just want to get to what I see as a basic tension within this issue. On one side, you've got the state saying, okay, we need to bring some equity to our zoning laws because in the past, they have not been equitable. They have been exclusionary. I think we have to recognize that. But on the other side, you have other cities saying, hey, don't give us a one-size-fits-all approach. Is there some middle ground here?
Well, I mean, what I would like to see happen is what happened in Shoreline is mandated. You have to increase density by a certain percentage. We actually already have that. It just doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. And then the local jurisdiction gets to decide how to do it.
Yeah.
We went block by block, sometimes parcel by parcel, trying to decide, okay, if we allow a high rise here, how does that affect the wetland there?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's a question. And,
right.
And you can plan for all that on a global level, but it's at the local level that you really have to make the fine distinctions. Yeah. Local government should have the authority to decide where the density goes. We should be required to put it somewhere.
Got it. And that's a big part of this discussion. Well, Mayor Woodward, maybe I can follow up with you on this whole idea of equity, because I know That was a very important part of the discussions going on around Boca here. Clearly, every city in our state is different. We're learning that very much so today. But is there some middle ground on zoning you think that all cities could agree on? Any thoughts on that?
Well, and I agree with Mayor Scully. I think it really should be up to the individual. Every city is different. And so that's why we took this by the reins and did it ourselves and did it the way that we believe would work by lots of community engagement. This is just a pilot project. Our Boca is just a one-year pilot project. But what we are doing right now is more of that neighborhood engagement, talking to the stakeholders, tweaking what we have already now as a pilot project, and hopefully implementing something much more permanent as we go through our comprehensive plan and our development codes and make this permanent by this summer.
Right. I know it expires in July. Did you have a thought?
Yeah, I want to go back to the equity thing a bit.
Please.
Most of the folks who own homes in Shoreline have been there a long time.
Okay.
And Shoreline has become increasingly diverse over the years. The immigrant folks, the people who are moving in from other countries or other regions, for the most part, don't own those properties.
I see.
Those properties are owned by folks who have been there a long time. In Shoreline, they're mostly white folks.
Yeah.
So it's not going to increase equity in that sense to say all those of you who already own homes, those homes are more valuable because now you can build on them. Right?
I see. Okay.
That doesn't necessarily make it accessible for anybody. That's just a boon for individual property owners who want to do that.
Okay, important part of the discussion. Thank you. We need to start wrapping up the show, and I really appreciate all this back and forth here. Mayor Woodward, just some final thoughts from you here about Spokane's experience with Boca and how that might serve as an example for state lawmakers working on this issue of missing middle housing right now.
Well, and it's getting a lot of attention, Brian. I'll just tell you that our development services department and our planning director they're getting calls right and left from not just cities throughout the state of Washington, but really throughout the country. This, as I mentioned, was a bold move, and it was something out of such distress and emergency crisis that we absolutely had to do something. But it was intentional. We spent more than a year looking at this, having very direct, honest, transparent conversations with those who do this work, those who need housing, so that we could come to a place where we had agreement on this and try it out for a year, tweak it. But we're very happy with what we have. It's gotten a lot of interest. There's a lot of pre-development permits out there, and we'll see what happens. But if we make it permanent, which I hope we do, that's where we're going to see the impact years down the road. This isn't going to change anything overnight, but we had to do something now so that we get the change that we want at some point.
Thanks very much. Mayor Scully, just thinking about this bill is being tweaked and changed as we speak here in mid-February. What do you want state lawmakers to be thinking about? What should they have in mind as they're talking about the missing middle bill and housing this session?
To mandate that cities take density, to let us decide exactly how to do it. I mean, most city councils take their jobs very seriously, and this is what we do. I mean, land use and budget are the two things city councils do, and we are best positioned to make the decisions at a local level. This is a fascinating conversation for me. I'd love to follow up on it because we are looking at this. I mean, Shoreline is considering something similar to that as a city ordinance. We are unlikely to do it citywide for all the reasons I've mentioned today, but we're likely to put it into some neighborhoods because some of our neighborhoods are close enough to high-capacity transit. They do have big enough lot sizes that this wouldn't really destroy the character of them. Others of them, not so much. It would really be a dramatic detriment to the way Shoreline looks now.
Thank you, Mayor Scully. Thank you, Mayor Woodward, as well. And we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the plan to increase middle housing in our state? One person writes, "If we limit growth in the city, we are encouraging sprawl and environmental destruction outside of the city." Another person counters, "Don't be fooled. This bill is a developer's dream and will accomplish the complete opposite." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattle.gov or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the state Supreme Court upended Washington's drug possession law 2 years ago. And now the clock is ticking for Olympia to create a new legal framework that balances criminal punishment with the need for treatment solutions. It's the complex story behind the Blake decision on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.